Every single article I read said the same number. $3,000 a month. Every forum post, every retirement calculator, every well-meaning friend who'd done the research for me. I had $1,500. Not $1,500 saved up on top of something else. $1,500 a month, total, from a small pension and Social Security combined. Half of what the internet insisted I needed to retire anywhere outside the United States. I moved to the Philippines anyway. And what I found once I got there had almost nothing to do with the number everyone kept warning me about. I spent 34 years as a nurse. Med-surg floor, mostly, in a mid-sized hospital in Sacramento. The kind of job where you come home smelling like antiseptic and too tired to cook, so you eat cereal standing over the sink and call it dinner. I loved the work more than I ever let on to my coworkers. I hated what it did to my back, my knees, and eventually my marriage. My husband and I divorced when I was 56. Amicable, as these things go, no affairs, no big betrayal, just two people who'd slowly stopped being able to talk about anything besides the mortgage and whose turn it was to deal with the gutters. He kept the house. I kept about half of what we'd built over 22 years, which sounded like more money than it turned out to be once lawyers and a new apartment were finished with it. I worked another 6 years after the divorce, partly because I needed to, partly because I genuinely didn't know who I was without a badge and a 12-hour shift. When I finally retired at 62, I did the math the way every nurse does everything, carefully, thoroughly, checking it twice. Social Security. A small pension from the hospital system. Together, just under $1,500 a month. I rented a one-bedroom apartment outside Sacramento, the cheapest decent one I could find, and it still ran me over $1,400 a month before a single utility bill or grocery run. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because it's the number that started everything. $1,400 just for 4 walls and a roof, out of $1,500 total income. That left almost nothing, not for the car, not for insurance, not for the occasional dinner with my daughter, who lived 40 minutes away and whom I saw maybe once a month because gas had gotten expensive enough that even that felt like a decision I had to make on purpose. I started selling things. Small things at first, jewelry I never wore, a set of good pots I'd kept since the wedding registry, books I told myself I'd read again someday. Then bigger things. My car, eventually, replaced with a much older one that broke down twice in its first year. I remember standing in my kitchen one evening, 63 years old, holding a phone bill I couldn't quite cover that month, and thinking, I gave this country 34 years on my feet in a hospital, and this is what's left. That was the night I opened my laptop and typed, half out of desperation and half out of curiosity, retire abroad on Social Security. And every single result told me the same thing. You need at least $3,000 a month to do this comfortably. I closed the laptop and cried, honestly, for the first time in longer than I want to admit. Because if 3,000 was the real number, I wasn't just short. I was less than halfway there. I want to describe what those last couple of years in Sacramento actually felt like day to day, because I think a lot of people watching this know exactly what I mean without needing much explanation. It's not dramatic poverty. Nobody's calling anyone to check on you. It's smaller than that. It's standing in the shower a little longer than usual just to feel warm water on a body that spent 34 years being useful to other people, and realizing that's become the one indulgence you still allow yourself. It's turning the thermostat down 2 degrees below comfortable and telling yourself it's fine, you'll adjust, and then never quite adjusting. It's a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep, the tiredness of constantly, quietly managing a life that shrunk smaller than the person living it. I'd worked since I was 19 years old. Nursing school, then the floor, then decades of shifts that started before sunrise and ended after dark. I had genuinely believed, the way most of us are raised to believe, that all those years would eventually add up to something that let you rest. Instead, I found myself, at 63, doing more anxious arithmetic than I'd ever done during actual hospital shifts, where at least the stakes were clear and the decisions had protocols. There was no protocol for this. There was just a phone bill, a kitchen table, and a growing suspicion that the life I'd earned wasn't actually available to me at the income one actually had. I want to be honest, I almost stopped looking right there. $3,000 felt like such an authoritative, official number, repeated so many times across so many sources, that I assumed the people writing it knew something I didn't. I spent about 2 months simply accepting it. $1,500 in America, forever, because apparently $1,500 wasn't enough anywhere. What changed my mind wasn't a single article. It was a comment section. I'd found one of those cost of living abroad videos, one of hundreds I'd started watching by then out of a kind of hopeless habit, and underneath it, buried past all the usual comments, was a woman writing that she'd been living outside Manila for 2 years on less than $1,600 a month and doing, in her words, better than I ever did back home. I almost scrolled past it. Something made me stop and read it twice. I wrote back to her, not really expecting a reply. She answered within a day, with a level of specific, patient detail that no article had ever given me. Actual rent numbers, actual grocery totals, actual advice about which parts of the country made $1,500 stretch and which parts would swallow it whole. She wasn't selling me anything. She wasn't a channel with sponsors. She was just a retired schoolteacher from Ohio being kind to a stranger with the same fear she'd once had herself. I spent the next 4 months doing the most careful research of my nursing-trained life. I compared cities. I joined 3 separate online groups for retirees living in the Philippines, specifically on modest, fixed incomes, not the glossy expat groups showing off condos with pools, but the practical ones, where people posted actual grocery receipts and argued cheerfully about which barangay had the best market prices. I learned the term province versus city, learned that $1 in a smaller city could sometimes do triple what it did in the capital. By month 5, I had a spreadsheet, old nursing habits die hard, with a projected monthly budget that fit inside $1,500 with a small cushion left over. I didn't fully believe my own numbers. I decided to test them the only way that would actually convince me: get on a plane and find out. I sold most of what remained in that Sacramento apartment, kept 2 suitcases and a small box of photographs, and at 63 years old, flew out with a one-way ticket, a spreadsheet I'd checked a dozen times, and a number in my head that every article on the internet had told me was impossible. My daughter drove me to the airport, and I remember she didn't say much on the drive, just kept glancing over at me like she was trying to memorize something. At the gate, she finally asked the question she'd clearly been holding the entire drive. "Mom, what if 1,500 really isn't enough, even there?" I didn't have a perfect answer for her. I told her the truth, that I'd done for months of the most careful research of my life, that I trusted the woman who'd written back to me, that I trusted my own spreadsheet more than I trusted a headline. I told her if it didn't work, I'd figure out the next thing, the way I'd figured out every hard thing in 34 years of nursing. She hugged me longer than usual and let me go through security without saying anything else. I think we both needed that flight to simply happen rather than to be talked to death first. Here are the 10 things I actually learned once I tried living on half of what everyone said I'd need, the things that turned out to matter far more than the number itself. Number 1. The 3,000 figure was never wrong, it was just aimed at someone else. This was the first thing I understood once I actually got here, and it changed how I read every article and video I'd consumed for months. $3,000 a month is a very real, very accurate number, if what you're picturing is a Western-style condo in a premium high-rise in the heart of Manila, meals out most nights at restaurants built for tourists, a car and driver, and a lifestyle designed to feel identical to the one you left behind, just cheaper. That number describes something specific. It's not a lie. It's just describing a completely different life than the one I ended up building. I wasn't trying to recreate Sacramento with better weather. I was trying to build a life that fit inside what I actually had. Once I stopped measuring myself against the recommended lifestyle and started measuring against my own spreadsheet, the entire equation changed. My first month, total spending including rent, came in at $1,340. I checked the math 3 times because I genuinely didn't believe it. There was almost a strange grief in that realization, if I'm honest, a quiet anger at how many years I'd spent believing a number that had never actually applied to the life I wanted. I wasn't chasing a high-rise. I was chasing a life where I could sleep through the night without doing arithmetic in my head. Once I understood the 3,000 figure was describing someone else's goals, not mine, the fear attached to my own number started to loosen its grip almost immediately. I think about how many people must read those same articles every year and simply close the laptop the way I almost did, assuming the door is closed to them specifically because of a single average figure that was never built with their actual life in mind. That number gets repeated so often, across so many sources quoting each other, that it starts to feel like a law of physics rather than what it actually is, a rough estimate of one particular lifestyle among dozens of possible ones. Number 2. Location did more work than any budgeting trick I tried. I want to be direct about this because I think it's the single most underrated piece of advice in this whole topic. Where you live inside a country matters as much as which country you pick. I didn't move to Manila. I moved to a smaller city about 3 hours outside it, on the recommendation of the woman who'd first written back to me in that comment section. Rent for a clean, simple 1-bedroom apartment there ran me $220 a month, furnished, with a small balcony. The same size apartment in the capital, in a building marketed toward foreigners, would have run 3 to 4 times that. The market here sells the same fresh fish, the same vegetables, the same rice, for a fraction of what a foreigner-facing grocery store in a big city charges. I didn't sacrifice quality to save money. I simply stopped shopping in the places built to make Americans feel comfortable, and started shopping where my neighbors actually shopped. I spent my first 2 weeks doing something I now recommend to anyone who asks. I compared prices at 3 different markets before settling into a routine, jotting them down in the same spreadsheet habit I'd carried from Sacramento. The difference between the market 15 minutes away and the one closer to the tourist strip near the plaza was, in some cases, nearly double for the exact same items. That single piece of homework, done in the first 2 weeks, quietly shaped every month's budget that followed. I also learned that the concept of expensive and cheap in this country isn't a single national number, the way most articles present it. It shifts block by block, city by city, sometimes even stall by stall in the same market. A friend in my coffee group who lives closer to the capital pays nearly triple what I pay for rent, and when we compare notes, we've realized we're technically living in the same country cost of living according to every online calculator, despite our actual monthly numbers looking almost nothing alike. The average hides more than it reveals. I stopped trusting national averages within my first 2 months here, and started trusting only the specific numbers from the specific street I actually lived on. Number 3. My nursing instincts made healthcare decisions easier than I expected. I'll admit I was more nervous about this one than almost anything else, given 34 years spent inside American hospitals watching exactly how expensive things could get when something went wrong. A routine checkup here, blood work included, cost me under $20. My blood pressure medication, the same brand I'd taken for years in the States, cost roughly a third of what I'd paid with insurance back home, including the copay. I did what my training told me to do. I researched the actual hospital in the nearest largest city before I needed one, not after. I found a well-regarded facility about 40 minutes away by bus, confirmed they handle the kind of care I might realistically need as I age, and built that knowledge into my sense of safety rather than my sense of fear. I pay $38 a month for a local health plan. It's not the same as American insurance, and I don't pretend it is. But between the plan and the genuinely low base cost of care, Healthcare has been, if anything, less stressful here than it ever was managing co-pays and deductibles back home. There's a particular relief that comes from no longer dreading the mail because of what a hospital bill might say. I hadn't realized how much low-grade anxiety that dread had been costing me until it was simply gone. I had a small scare in my 8th month, a fall on a wet market floor that bruised my hip badly enough to need an X-ray. Every instinct from 34 years in American hospitals braced for the bill before I'd even finished being examined. It came to just under $50, total, including the imaging. I sat in the waiting area afterward and actually laughed, a short, surprised laugh, at how much of my life I'd spent flinching in advance of costs that simply didn't exist here the way they did back home. Number 4. I learned to cook again, and it quietly saved me hundreds. Back in Sacramento, toward the end, I ate like someone too tired and too broke to care. Cereal, frozen dinners, the cheapest thing in the cart regardless of what it actually was. Here, the market is 15 minutes away on foot, and the produce is fresher and cheaper than anything I could get delivered to a Sacramento apartment. I started cooking real meals again for the first time in years, mostly because it was genuinely cheaper than not cooking, but the side effect surprised me. I started looking forward to dinner. I started timing my days around a trip to the market the way I used to time them around a hospital shift. A full week of groceries, fish, vegetables, rice, fruit, runs me somewhere between $30 and $40. In Sacramento, that same week would have cost me close to that in a single grocery trip, and would have tasted like far less effort had gone into it. I've since started sharing meals occasionally with a widower 2 doors down, an arrangement that began almost by accident when I made too much soup one evening and knocked on his door rather than let it go to waste. It's become a small, unplanned Wednesday ritual between us, and it didn't cost either of us anything extra to build, just a slightly bigger pot and a willingness to knock. I think about how much of my old grocery spending in Sacramento wasn't really about the food at all. It was about exhaustion, buying whatever required the least effort at the end of a long shift, regardless of price, because I simply didn't have the energy left to compare or plan. Retirement gave me back the one resource that had been missing the whole time, the time and energy to actually shop and cook with intention. It turns out a fair amount of what people call the high cost of American groceries is really the cost of convenience bought by people too tired to do anything else. I wasn't too tired anymore. That alone reshaped an entire category of my budget. Number 5. I stopped needing a car, and that alone changed my monthly math. I hadn't fully calculated, until I got here, how much of my old $1,500 budget in America had been quietly eaten by a vehicle, insurance, gas, repairs on a car old enough to need them constantly. Here, I don't own one. Tricycles get me around my immediate neighborhood for less than $1 a ride. A jeepney into the bigger part of town costs pocket change. For longer trips, a rideshare app handles it for a few dollars. I've done the calculation more than once. What I spend monthly on all transportation combined here is less than what a single car insurance payment cost me back home. I didn't plan for this to be one of the biggest savings. It simply turned out to be one of the largest, quietest ones. There was an adjustment period, admittedly. I missed the independence of a car for the first month or so, the ability to simply decide to go somewhere without waiting on a schedule. But I've come to actually prefer the rhythm of relying on tricycles and jeepneys. It puts me in contact with people every single day, brief conversations with drivers and fellow passengers that a car would have insulated me from entirely. Number 6. The loneliness of those last Sacramento years didn't follow me the way I feared it would. I want to be honest about something I didn't expect. In my last 2 years in America, I had become genuinely isolated, not dramatically, just slowly, the way it happens when money gets tight and every social outing starts to feel like a decision you have to justify. I worried that same isolation would simply relocate with me. For the first 6 or 7 weeks, it did, more or less. New country, new language, no built-in community. But I found something here that I hadn't had in Sacramento in years, a standing weekly coffee meetup with 4 other retired women, 3 American, 1 Australian, all of us living on modest fixed incomes and completely unbothered by that fact with each other. We compare grocery finds instead of doctor's appointments. We trade advice instead of complaints about the cost of everything. It's the most consistent, reliable social circle I've had since I stopped working. I remember the exact conversation that turned the group from acquaintances into something closer to family. One of the women, the Australian, admitted one Tuesday that she'd been quietly rationing her medication that month to make the budget stretch. Instead of the awkward silence I half expected, 3 separate women started calculating, out loud, how to help cover the gap without making her feel like charity. It got handled within 20 minutes, gently, practically, the way people who've all done hard math themselves know how to help someone else do it. That kind of moment simply didn't exist in my life during those last isolated years in Sacramento. I had neighbors I waved at. I did not have people who would notice, within a week, if I stopped showing up somewhere, and who would actually do something about it rather than just feel briefly concerned before moving on with their own day. There's a particular safety in being surrounded by people who've all crossed the same ocean carrying roughly the same fears, and who've all quietly agreed, without ever formally saying so, to catch each other when the numbers get tight. Number 7. I rediscovered a kind of physical ease my knees hadn't felt in a decade. 34 years on a hospital floor does something specific to a person's knees and back. By the time I retired, stairs had become a genuine consideration in my day, not an afterthought. The warmth here has done something I wasn't expecting for the stiffness that had built up over 3 decades of 12-hour shifts. I'm not going to claim it's a medical miracle. It isn't, and I still see a doctor regularly. But the ease of movement, the lack of cold mornings seizing up muscles that were already tired from years of standing, has been real and noticeable. I walk more here than I did in the last 5 years in Sacramento combined, not because I'm forcing myself to for health reasons, but because walking here is simply pleasant in a way it stopped being pleasant back home once the weather and my knees both turned against me. My daily walk now takes me past the same small shrine, the same fruit vendor, the same stretch of water near the edge of town, and there's something almost meditative about a body that used to dread movement now looking forward to it every single morning without being asked. I brought a cane with me when I moved, half expecting to need it more here than I had back home, given how much walking I assumed the lifestyle would demand. It sat in the corner of my closet, mostly unused, for over a year now. I don't say that to suggest anyone else's body will respond exactly the way mine did. Every body carries its own history, and mine simply responded well to warmth after decades of cold hospital corridors and harsher winters than I ever admitted bothered me. But I'd be leaving something important out if I didn't mention how much of my old daily discomfort simply eased on its own, without a single doctor's appointment dedicated to it. Number 8. My daughter's worry turned into one of the best relationships we've had in years. She was frightened when I told her, and I understood why. A single woman in her 60s, moving alone to a country she'd never visited, on a budget that made the whole plan sound, to her, more like an act of desperation than a decision. She visited 4 months in, expecting, I think, to find her mother in some diminished version of the life she remembered. What she found instead was an apartment that was small but genuinely cheerful, a mother who'd lost the tired, tight look she'd been wearing for the last several Sacramento years, and a Tuesday coffee group who greeted her daughter by name because I'd clearly talked about her visit for weeks beforehand. She cried a little on that trip, the good kind, and told me on the flight home, over a video call once she'd landed, that she finally understood why I'd done this. Our calls now longer and lighter than they'd been in years. She asks about the coffee group. She asks what's in season at the market. The worry didn't disappear, but it stopped being the loudest thing in every conversation we had. She's already asked about coming back for a longer stay next year, maybe even bringing her husband this time, and I notice that every time she brings it up now, it's with an excitement that has nothing left in it of the fear the first phone call carried. There's a particular exchange from that visit I still think about often. On her last night, we were sitting on my small balcony, and she said, almost to herself, "I used to think I'd have to take care of you eventually. Financially, I mean, once the pension ran thin. I don't think about that anymore." I hadn't realized she'd been quietly carrying that worry until she said it out loud, and I hadn't realized how much weight had lifted off both of us the moment she stopped needing to. Number 9. I learned the difference between cheap and careful, and it changed how I spend. There's a distinction I didn't fully understand until I lived here for a while. Cheap is buying the lowest quality version of everything because you're afraid of every peso leaving your hand. Careful is knowing exactly what things should cost, and refusing to overpay simply because you're a foreigner who doesn't know better. I learned, slowly, which market stalls gave fair prices and which ones quoted higher numbers to visitors. I learned to ask my Tuesday coffee group before any larger purchase, because between the 5 of us, someone always already knew the fair price for anything from a new phone case to a repairman's rate. That knowledge, shared and built over months, has probably saved me more money than any single budgeting decision I made back in America. Being careful, it turns out, isn't the same as living small. It's simply living accurately. I've started keeping a small shared notebook with the coffee group specifically for this. Fair prices for common repairs, reliable contacts, honest vendors. It's an unglamorous document, water-stained now from a spilled cup one Tuesday, but it's probably worth more to the 5 of us than any single financial article any of us read before we moved here. I made mistakes early on, the kind almost every newcomer makes. I overpaid a repairman in my second month for a leaking faucet, something I only found out weeks later when I mentioned the price to my landlord's sister and watched her eyebrows go up. I wasn't angry about it, not really. It was a small enough amount, and I understood it as tuition, the cost of learning a new place. What I noticed, though, was how quickly that kind of mistake stopped happening once I had a real local network instead of just guesses and internet forums. Community turned out to be a financial strategy as much as an emotional one, something none of the 3000a-month articles had ever thought to mention. Number 10. I stopped apologizing for my number, because it was never the whole story. This is the lesson that took the longest to settle, and it's the one I think about most now. For years in America, $1,500 a month felt like a confession I had to make quietly, almost apologetically, whenever the subject of money came up. It felt like proof that I hadn't done something right, that 34 years of work should have added up to more than this. Here, that same number isn't a confession. It's simply a fact, one that fits comfortably into the life I've actually built. I have a clean apartment, real meals I look forward to cooking, a weekly circle of women who know my name and my stories, a daughter who calls not out of worry but out of genuine interest in my week, and knees that don't ache the way they used to. None of that required $3,000. It required the right place, the right information, and the willingness to stop believing a number I'd never actually tested for myself. I think back sometimes to that night in my Sacramento kitchen, holding a phone bill I couldn't quite cover, believing 34 years of work had somehow added up to less than it should have. I know now that it wasn't the years that had failed me. It was the number I'd been told to measure them against. I don't want to pretend this is a universal formula, because I don't think it is. $1,500 a month isn't a guarantee anywhere, and the specific choices that made it work for me, the smaller city, the local market, the modest apartment, won't be the right choices for everyone watching this. I also don't want to pretend it's been perfect. There have been months where something unexpected came up and my cushion got thinner than I liked. There have been evenings, fewer now than at the start, where I still miss the particular sound of my daughter's old house, or a specific diner booth in Sacramento I used to sit in after a hard shift. Moving on half of what you were told you needed doesn't erase the parts of you that are still, in some quiet way, homesick. It just gives those feelings somewhere more peaceful to sit. What I do want to say, clearly, is that the number I was told I needed and the number I actually needed turned out to be two very different things, and the gap between them was filled almost entirely by research, patience, and the willingness to build a life that fit my actual income instead of chasing a lifestyle designed for someone else's. I spent 34 years taking care of other people on my feet in a hospital, and I spent the 2 years after retiring taking care of a budget that never seemed to take care of me back. I don't do that math anymore, not the anxious kind. I still keep a spreadsheet. Some habits are permanent, but it's a spreadsheet that finishes every month the same quiet, unremarkable way, with money still in the account and nothing left to apologize for. If you've been told a number that feels impossibly out of reach, and you've quietly stopped believing retirement abroad is something available to someone like you, I just ask you to check that number the way I finally did, not by trusting the first article that comes up, but by finding real people, living real, modest lives, and asking them honestly what it actually costs. If this helped you see that a little more clearly, stay a while. I share stories like this one honestly, spreadsheet and all, and I'd be glad of the company. Thank you for watching. And if you're doing that same quiet math on your own kitchen table right now, consider subscribing. The next story might be exactly the number you've been looking for.